Subcommittees will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittees at any time. Members of the full committee who are not members of the subcommittees on monetary policy and trade or terrorism and illicit finance may participate in today's hearing. And all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is entitled Increasing the Effectiveness of Non-Nuclear Sanctions Against Iran. I now recognize myself for 2.5 minutes to give an opening statement. As chairman of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, it's a pleasure for me to join Chairman Pierce and my colleagues on the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee in holding this joint hearing. It's no secret that Washington has been deeply divided over how to confront Iran's nuclear ambitions, both before and after implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This hearing, however, is not about the JCPOA per se, and I'm hopeful that we can find common ground in addressing Iran's non-nuclear activities, including terrorism, weapons procurement, and regional destabilization. Since the agreement's implementation day in January of 2016, Iran has continued to sponsor Hezbollah and other militias in the region. Its support for the Assad regime alone, including the use of planes to airlift military supplies, has helped claim an estimated 400,000 lives. Last April, even President Obama suggested that the Iranians were violating the spirit of the deal by engaging in these activities. Rather than be deterred, Iran went on in October to sentence 3 Americans to long prison terms on bogus charges. In January of this year, the country tested a ballistic missile in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, and this very morning, just as Boeing was announcing new sales to Iran, we learned that dozens of Syrian civilians, including at least 11 children, were gassed in a chemical weapons attack. If Republicans and Democrats can agree that intensifying non-nuclear sanctions is key for our national security, then we should think of new ways that deepen their impact on Iranian behavior. Iran's continued illicit activities underscore that we must not be complacent. Non-nuclear sanctions are more than a form of condemnation. We should expect them to undermine Iran's capabilities and influence Iranian policies. In closing, I want to emphasize that U.S. sanctions are directed against an authoritarian government, not the many ordinary Iranians who denounce terrorism and welcome closer relations with our country. These Iranians know the regime has failed them for decades, and they know that the only choice for Iran is to abandon its anti-Western, anti-Semitic violent extremism. Our sanctions should make that choice as explicit as possible. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, the ranking member of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, Congresswoman Moore, for 2.5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for joining us. I've been on record in support of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action negotiated and implemented by Obama to derail Iran's nuclear ambitions. That being said, I'm going to use this time to discuss President Trump's ongoing and increasingly problematic foreign and business entanglements. PBS reports that Trump engaged in a business deal with a money launderer with supposed ties to the notorious Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, a Mr. Anar Mammadov. The project was a hotel in Baku, Azerbaijan. Ivanka was involved as well. One example, but these political and financial entanglements between bad hombres and Trump keep cropping up. We have a commerce secretary that was former vice chair of the Bank of Cyprus, a bank that participated in deals with unsavory Kremlin-backed individuals, and the Russian state-run bank, Sberbank, which is subject to U.S. and EU sanctions. We have jaw-dropping allegations that rise at least to the probable cause case against Trump associates and family members such as Manafort, Page, Tillerson, Flynn, Stone, Ivanka, and her husband, Jared Kushner. These are troubling financial ties to the Kremlins, Iranians, or the Chinese government, saying nothing of its D.C. hotel or the Mar-a-Lago, which are gross conflicts that should not be permitted to continue for one more second. These communities should use our subpoena power to bring some of these people in to testify under oath to this joint committee so we can get a better understanding of these ties, and the American people deserve to know. It is a Pyrrhic exercise to go over the JCPA over and over again when the Trump administration has invited all the world's worst actors into the White House in order to enrich him and his family, like this third world-like kleptocracy that would make Ferdinand Marcos blush. And with that, I would yield my 27 seconds to Mr. Perlmutter.
No, I think we each have, I have my own time.
You do? Okay.
So keep going.
No, I'm done. I'm yielding back.
I yield her 27 seconds back to her. Okay.
No, I'll yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, the chairman of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee, Congressman Pierce, for 1.5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. New to the Financial Services Committee and the 115th Congress, the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee has the direct mission of interpreting to the greatest extent possible the financial support networks of national security interests. Our new subcommittee is honored to join Chairman Barr's Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee this afternoon to assess the current state of Iran's non-nuclear sanctions. First designated as state sponsor of terrorism in 1984, Iran has grown into the global leader in terrorist financing. The message is clear. Despite our nation's best efforts, Iran continues to be the foremost sponsor of terrorism globally. This is not anecdotal or subjective. This is U.S. State Department's annual country report on terrorism has continually listed Iran as the top illicit financier, and the most recent report stated Iran remains the foremost state sponsor of terrorism. From its continued support and assistance to the Assad regime in Syria to its financial backing of Hezbollah and its reliance on its intelligence and security arms, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and its elite Quds force, Iran has been near impervious to U.S. and international sanctions. No silver bullet exists to prevent and impede Iran's actions. Despite U.S. and international sanctions combined with a stagnant oil market in 2014, Iran continued to fund and supply international terror groups, even when it was to the detriment of its own people and economy. Today's hearing, therefore, begins a much-needed conversation. Where has the United States succeeded and where has it failed in its targeted actions against Iran? What actions, if any, can the Financial Services Committee take? What actions should be avoided? I thank our witnesses for being here today and Chairman Barr for holding this important joint hearing. Look forward to the conversations. Yield back.
Thank you. And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, the ranking member of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee, Congressman Perlmutter, for 2.5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Barr. I'd like to introduce into the record a letter dated March 30th, 2017, from Senators Brown, Feinstein, and Cardin to James Comey, and also an article in the Washington Post dated April 3rd, 2017, concerning both of them have as their subjects the the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that
Without objection.
Congressman Pierce was just referring to.
Without objection.
So I thank the gentleman from Kentucky. I thank my friend from New Mexico and Ms. Moore from Wisconsin. There are several important questions before us today. First, I assume my friends on the other side of the aisle are going to bring forth some questions about the JCPOA, which I call a Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. And we just want to see exactly how that has transpired or how it has worked so far. I think it has reduced nuclear tension in the world. But even so, we all agree Iran, and in particular the IRGC, is a real threat and destabilizing force in the Middle East. The IRGC is heavily involved in just about every aspect of the Iranian economy, including oil, construction, and banking. And with vast shell corporations and commercial interests all over the world, the IRGC strategically and conspicuously moves money through its many front businesses, and we need to understand the beneficial ownership of those businesses. We also need to understand, to the degree that Russia is supporting Iran and the IRGC, we want to see exactly how that kind of funding exists. So the new committee that we have formed here is Terrorism and Illicit Finance, and we want to see the connections to this potential money laundering that's going around that is funding terrorism around the globe. And I think in particular, we've got to see the activities of the IRGC as well as their connection to Russia, which is using Iran as kind of a place to advance its interests in the Middle East. And with that, I would yield back to the chair and look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today.
Thank you, and the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, the vice chair of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee, Congressman Pittenger, for a 1-minute opening statement. Mr. Pittenger here? Mr. Pittenger's not here, so we will go ahead and turn to witness testimony. Today, we welcome the testimony of Mr. Ben Talablu. He is a senior Iran analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Previously, Ben Talablu served as a non-resident Iran Research Fellow and Iran Research Analyst at FDD. Ben Talablu frequently briefs Washington audience on a host of Iran-related issues. Ben earned his master's degree in international relations from the University of Chicago. Mr. J. Matthew McInnes is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Iran, specifically its intentions, strategic culture, military power, and goals. Previously, Mr. McInnes served as a senior analyst and in other leadership positions for the U.S. Department of Defense, including work with U.S. Central Command from 2006 to 2013. Mr. McInnes has a master's degree in European Studies from NYU and a master's degree in international relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Suzanne Maloney is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, is deputy director of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Dr. Maloney previously served as an external advisor to senior State Department officials on long-term issues related to Iran. Before joining Brookings, she served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff as Middle East advisor for ExxonMobil Corporation and director of the 2004 Council of Foreign Relations Task Force on U.S. Policy toward Iran. She holds a doctorate from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and an expert at its Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance, focused on Iran. Prior to joining FDD, Dr. Ottolenghi headed the Transatlantic Institute in Brussels and taught Israel Studies at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University. Dr. Ottolenghi obtained his PhD in political theory at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Ben Talablu, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Barr and Pierce, Ranking Members Moore and Perlmutter, distinguished members of the Committee on Financial Services. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for providing me with this opportunity to testify, particularly alongside such a distinguished panel. Today I will discuss the Islamic Republic of Iran's non-nuclear threats and how best to counter them. Despite being called comprehensive, the JCPOA nuclear deal overshadowing this discussion was anything but. It does not address delivery vehicles for nuclear weapons like ballistic missiles. It also does not address Tehran's illicit financial activities, support for terrorism, regional destabilization, and flagrant human rights abuses. These issues constitute Iran's enduring non-nuclear threats. They are enduring because they are the same issues that have made and kept Iran an international pariah for over 3 decades. Worse, they are threats that the JCPOA accentuates. According to FDD's survey of open-source English and Persian language reporting on Iran, Iran has launched up to 14 ballistic missiles since inking the deal. Such behavior defies the annex of UNSCR 2231 codifying the accord. These include 2 upgrades to a solid-fueled short-range ballistic missile, a new medium-range ballistic missile that allegedly has a maneuverable reentry vehicle, and a ballistic missile bearing a proclamation threatening the State of Israel with genocide. According to the former Director of National Intelligence, Iran currently possesses the largest arsenal of ballistic missiles in the Middle East. This arsenal's lethality is enhanced by flight testing and domestic refinement. Iran also continues to exemplify the state sponsor of terrorism epithet bequeathed to it by the State Department 3 decades ago. For the past 5 years, however, Tehran has furnished the Assad regime in Syria with money, men, and munitions so that it can continue the war against its own people. Iran is also creating something of a Shia international, marshaling zealous Shias from around the region, including Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, to fight and die in Syria. Elsewhere, Tehran relies on a tried-and-true method, distributing low-cost weaponry like anti-tank missiles to jurisdictions of weak central authority. Nowhere exemplifies this better than Yemen. Despite a ban on arms transfers in UNSCR 2231, weapons transfers to Yemen have been seized at least 4 times by coalition forces. Iran's illicit financial activities also continue undermining the integrity of the rules-based financial order. These activities involve the movement of money to illicitly procure parts and technology for Iran's missile program, as well as sponsoring terrorist activities. However, even innocuous-looking transactions may involve illicit actors. Iran remains designated by the U.S. Treasury Department as a, quote, jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern. The hesitancy exhibited by European banks towards doing business with Iran is indicative of this status, in addition to their concerns over institutions which lack anti-money laundering controls. Fortunately, nowhere in the JCPOA is the U.S. restricted from using diplomatic, informational, military, and economic tools to challenge these activities. By enforcing existing sanctions and levying conduct-based non-nuclear ones, Congress and the administration can signal that there is a strategy guiding Washington's Iran policy. Such a policy would have 3 goals: punishment for past illicit activities, coercion to alter Iran's calculus to cease its present bad behavior, and third, deterrence to forestall prospective bad behavior. In my written testimony, I have provided 4 likely scenarios that would require coercive economic measures based on Iran's existing capabilities and intentions. I also offered 10 broader recommendations like new reporting requirements to enhance existing sanctions, targeting Iran's IRGC pursuant to 2 additional executive orders, using the Global Magnitsky Act to target corrupt Iranian entities, and developing graduated, sector-specific sanctions on Iran's domestic ballistic missile supply chain to neatly complement the web of export controls already in place. I can also speak to non-statutory measures if asked in the Q&A. In my written testimony, I similarly explain and refute Iran's claims that such actions violate the deal. They do not. These arguments can be overcome if the U.S. adheres to 3 principles. 1, calling Iran's bluff on walking away from the deal in response to such measures. 2, contesting Iran's narrative that it is a member of the international community in good standing. And 3, putting the spotlight on Iran through sophisticated use of the bully pulpit. Additionally, the U.S. should not fall for arguments about a perceived lack of sanctions relief when it has already lived by its deal requirements. To quote Adam Zubin of the Treasury Department, the JCPOA is an international agreement, not a cashier's check. While sanctions relief has made it harder to influence Iranian behavior, it is still not impossible. Congress and the administration have the capability to push for a change in behavior by imposing costs. However, as in most international crises, the balance of resolve will matter just as much, if not as more, than the balance of capability. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you. Mr. Matthew McInnes, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Moore, and Ranking Member Perlmutter, and distinguished committee members. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today on this important issue. Some had hoped after the implementation of the JCPOA that Iran would moderate its support to proxy and terrorist groups, restrict its ballistic missile testing and cyber activities, and refrain from risky and unprofessional actions at sea in the Persian Gulf. However, we have seen all of these activities not only continue but increase since the nuclear deal. As U.S. CENTCOM Commander General Joseph Votel stated in testimony before the House Armed Services Committee last week, Iran poses the greatest long-term threat to stability in this part of the world. Why is Iran such a disruptive force in the region? Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, reshaping the Middle East under its political and ideological image has driven Tehran's foreign policy. The wars in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, along with new resources from the nuclear deal, have brought us to an inflection point in Iran's strategy in the region. Tehran is turning its traditional network of proxies, led by Lebanese Hezbollah, into a transnational army that can conduct hybrid warfare and operate from Beirut to Basra to Sana'a, with Shia militias drawn from across South Asia and the Middle East. These forces are led by the IRGC, with an estimated 250,000 personnel potentially responsive to their direction. In addition to proxies, Iran's efforts to dominate the region extend to more traditional military forces. Tehran has historically lacked sufficient air and land forces to project conventional power beyond its borders. Ballistic missiles and its asymmetric naval forces in the Persian Gulf have served as substitutes. A critical question following the JCPOA is whether Iran can or will use its new resources to successfully modernize its military and permanently alter the regional balance of power in the coming decades. So how do we stand up to Iran's destabilizing activities and begin to dismantle Tehran's global terror network? The United States needs to reinvigorate a well-coordinated political, economic, military, and intelligence campaign against Iran's malign influence. A better sanctions strategy should be nested at the heart of this effort, given at least 20% of Iran's GDP is now under the Guard's control. The IRGC owns the state's largest construction firm, Catalambia, and holds major stakes in the banking, energy, extractive, and manufacturing sectors. The Guard also operates most Iranian ports and is deeply involved in the commercial shipping and aviation sectors, which are critical elements in building and sustaining its proxy and terror networks in the Middle East. However, Washington needs to ask first what we want to accomplish with our sanctions, rather than focusing solely on the targets and means. With this in mind, any Iran sanctions strategy must first blunt and then diminish the foundations of the IRGC's destabilizing activities. Consequently, the United States should aim for these 5 objectives. First, we should suppress Iran's military modernization to maintain the U.S.'s and our allies' military superiority in the region. We should prevent Iran from making major military breakthroughs and maintain our deterrence advantage against Tehran. We should seek to deter Russian and Chinese and other sales of the most advanced equipment to Iran through new sanctions and prevent any efforts to evade UN conventional weapons sanctions while they remain. Second, we should starve the IRGC's financial fuel. We should seek to weaken the Guard's ability to generate revenue from global markets and incentivize international divestment from IRGC-affiliated businesses. Third, we should disrupt the IRGC's logistical abilities, including close monitoring of potential new sanctions and designations against Iranian commercial aircraft used by the IRGC for the illicit transport of weapons and personnel into Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. Fourth, we should disrupt and deter Iran's ballistic missile program. We may not be able to stop the program entirely, but we can help push their program more in the box by disrupting their technological acquisition through additional sanctions. Fifth, we should drive down Iran's internal confidence in the regime and its policies. To the degree that we can, the U.S. should expose through sanctions the regime's internal contradictions, corruptions, massive expenses on overseas adventures, and human rights violations. There's an important caveat. Any new sanctions should not conflict, at least legally, with the JCPOA. However, any such sanctions can and likely should be part of a broader approach to shape the negotiating environment for a successor or supplementary agreement with Iran to address the key flaws of the nuclear deal. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this important topic and welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Maloney, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I've submitted a statement for the record noting that Brookings does not take institutional positions on policy issues. In considering the non-nuclear threats posed by Iran, we must also recognize the dividends of the nuclear agreement. The accord addressed only one dimension of the Iranian threat, and in those narrow terms it has succeeded. Amidst the turbulence and tragedy that besets the Middle East today, the absence of constraints on Iran's nuclear capabilities would magnify the risks in terrible ways. However, as my panelist has stated, we can't ignore the finite ramifications of the deal. Hopes that the agreement would jumpstart wider moderation in Iran's approach to the world have proven unfounded. Instead, Iran has continued to do what it has done consistently since 1979, deploying violence and subversion to extend its influence across the Middle East. It is consolidating a predominant position in the region and tentatively reorienting the regional order in its favor. As a result, the challenges posed by Tehran to U.S. interests and allies remain as relevant and as alarming as ever. Understanding the motivations behind Iran's regional ambitions and its ballistic missile program are vital. Historical memory and years of violent challenge to the theocracy's existence have stoked an acute, abiding sense of insecurity amongst its leadership. Tehran prioritizes regime survival above all else, and self-preservation has become intertwined with a deeply ingrained conviction that the world, led by Washington, is bent on its eradication. The consequences of this dystopian vision can be seen in Tehran's campaign to cultivate allies and proxies, bolster its indigenous deterrent capabilities, expand the revolution's strategic depth, and deploy violence and subversion across the region. Iran's regional adventurism has never enhanced the security or prosperity of the Iranian people, but it has helped keep the regime in power. The experience of the past decade underscores the efficacy of sanctions when wielded wisely. Sanctions forced Iran to make concessions on its nuclear program. However, it is not clear that new authorities are particularly useful or necessary for pushing back against Iran's non-nuclear threats. The deal left intact significant restrictions on Iran's economy. Iran's worst actors, including those associated with the Revolutionary Guard, remain designated under existing sanctions, tainting by extension any company that deals with them. The Trump administration can augment the list of designated entities at any time. The primary embargo on U.S. trade and investment in Iran criminalizes even the most tangential involvement in the Iranian economy by U.S. firms, except for specific exemptions. And all these measures benefit from a number of powerful force multipliers, including a decade of intensifying restrictions and rigorous enforcement that has created a culture of compliance in the international business community. The success of the nuclear sanctions has fostered the perception that these measures can serve as a silver bullet. However, there are few guarantees that new measures will provide sufficient disincentives to alter Tehran's longstanding patterns of regional power projection or revise the broad calculus of opportunism and insecurity that underlines its policies. The long-term track record underscores the unfortunate reality. Iran's support for terrorism has never been driven primarily or even substantially by resource availability. In fact, Iran's most destructive regional policies have been undertaken and sustained even at times of epic constraints. Sanctions and lower oil prices have provided no remedy to Iran's efforts to extend its influence or its substantial investment in fueling and fighting conflicts in Iraq and Syria. These policies have a very low funding threshold for the Islamic Republic and an existential importance to the regime. In addition, the sanctions regime that was constructed over the 12-year nuclear crisis benefited from an exceptional degree of multilateral support and consensus. Compounded by concerns beyond the nuclear file and encouraged by a well-coordinated campaign that highlighted the non-sanctions risks to business with Iran, many of Iran's major trading partners gradually committed to sever economic ties with Tehran. Multilateralism is key to sanctions adherence and creates an interlocking and often redundant web of pressure that proved far stronger and more persuasive than the sum of its parts. At this time, Washington does not have, nor can we quickly instigate anything close to the level of multilateral consensus that was built slowly and through fortuitous confluence on the nuclear issue. We must also anticipate Iran's responses to sanctions, both in terms of bandwagoning to try to hedge by developing further business and diplomatic ties with Europe and the rest of the world, as well as its retaliatory capacity against U.S. forces in the region. Like most complex challenges, the problem of Iran has resisted quick fixes for nearly 4 decades. American leadership will remain essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Ottolenghi, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Barr and Pierce, ranking members Moore and Perlmutter, distinguished members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, has emboldened Iran. In theory, under the JCPOA, the United States can use non-nuclear sanctions to counter Iran's regional ambitions and ongoing support for terrorism. In practice, however, this measure has been rarely used, especially with regards to Iran's ongoing airlifts to the Assad regime and Hezbollah. The JCPOA lifted U.S. sanctions against Iran's civil aviation sector exactly at the time when the sector became vital to Tehran's war efforts in Syria. Put simply, the JCPOA has made it legal to sell aircraft to airlines that are accessories to Assad's war crimes and keep Hezbollah armed to the teeth. The activities of Iran's aviation sector have exposed the inadequacy of the JCPOA caveat that licensed items and services must be used exclusively for commercial passenger aviation. Currently, at least 5 Iranian and 2 Syrian commercial airlines are engaged in regular military airlifts to Syria. These carriers have been crisscrossing Iraqi airspace since 2011, but have increased their tempo since the summer of 2015 when Iran and Russia coordinated their efforts to save Assad's regime. Flight tracking data indicate that from implementation day on January 16, 2016 to March 30th, 2017, there were 696 flights from Iran to Syria, only 6 of which were carried out by Iran's Air Force. In 2011, the Department of Treasury blacklisted Iran Air and Mahan Air because they colluded with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, in these military airlifts. It also blacklisted Syrian Arab Airlines in 2013 and Sham Wings in 2016 for transporting weapons and fighters to Syria. These airlines are not ferrying civilian passengers between Tehran and Damascus. Slide 2, please. The 2 primary Iranian actors in the airlifts are Iran Air and Mahan Air, with a combined 345 out of 696 flights, almost half of the total. Slide 3, please. Mahan Air remains under U.S. sanctions because of its support for terrorism. Iran Air, by contrast, is no longer sanctioned, despite its material support to the IRGC and Syria's internal repression, despite weapons transfers to Syria and the use of deceptive practices to conceal its cargo. The U.S. government delisted Iran Air because of a political agreement. There is no evidence that there has been a change of behavior. Slide 4, please. It is extremely likely that Iran Air is still an active participant in the airlifts. This conclusion is based on the following. There is no justification for frequent commercial flights to Damascus. Syria is a war zone with little tourism or commerce. Yes, it is served almost twice daily. Slide 5, please. Iran Air flies to Damascus twice a week. The flight cannot be purchased on Iran Air's booking website or through travel agencies, and the booking website does not include Damascus among its destinations, as shown on the slide, from Tehran's international airport, where the flights usually originate. And lastly, Iran Air flights to Damascus occasionally make unscheduled stopovers in Abadan, an IRGC logistical hub for the Syria airlifts. Slide 6, please. Now, Iran Air's participation in the Syria airlifts would make the airline eligible for renewed sanctions. Congress and the administration should instruct the intelligence community to investigate this. If Iran Air's participation is confirmed, the administration should immediately revoke OFAC's licenses authorizing sales of aviation industry items and services to Iran Air, re-sanction the airline, and relist its entire fleet. That's why Congress should also demand transparency about aircraft sales to Iran. The financial terms of the Boeing and Airbus deals are surprisingly opaque. If Iran Air is found to be ferrying weapons and fighters to Syria, the 2 manufacturers would unwittingly become accessories to war crimes. Congress should demand that Boeing and Airbus make those details fully public. The United States should also renew its focus on Mahan Air, Iran's largest commercial carrier and the most active participant in the airlift. Existing U.S. sanctions have not stopped European and Asian companies from transacting with Mahan. It is not that U.S. sanctions are ineffective, it is rather that the U.S. has so far declined to impose sanctions against those who provide material support to Mahan. It is time to reverse that and punish Iranian and foreign providers of material support to Syria's airlift and its participants, first and foremost, Mahan Air. FDD research has identified Abadan as the main IRGC logistical hub for the airlifts to Syria. Abadan and other airports where flights originate should also be designated. And finally, to conclude, the U.S. also should consider designating 1. the Abadan Refining Company for selling jet fuel to the aircraft involved in the airlifts, sanction the insurers of the aircraft, and target the financial institutions involved. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. To Mr. Telablu, first question would be, what specific non-nuclear sanctions and additional designations do you believe would be most effective in combating Iranian sponsorship of terrorism?
Thank you very much for your question, Congressman. The immediate one that comes to mind is to pursue sanctions actually on Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps pursuant to Executive Order 13224. Getting that listed, I think, is key because that is one of the major drivers of Iran's non-nuclear threats. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force, for instance, is the force that oversees Iran's ballistic missile program. Going after the IRGC pursuant to that executive order and then asking the intelligence community and the administration for additional targets that liaise with the IRGC and can be targeted for being shells for this entity should be gone after, both at the statutory level and at the administration.
Mr. McGinnis, in a related note, as you may know, Senator Ted Cruz in January introduced legislation calling on the State Department to assess IRGC's suitability for designation as a foreign terrorist organization. What are your thoughts about that? Do you agree with your colleague there that designation of IRGC under 13224 would be prudent?
Yes, I think for designation of as a foreign terrorist organization as an FTO, there is certainly a moral argument to make for that. I think from a practical standpoint, I think designation under Executive Order 13224 is most likely sufficient to achieve your objectives. I think that there is a great consideration, as Dr. Maloney pointed out, that as we look at potential retaliation from the Iranians, that not to say that that should stop us from taking any of these measures, but we need to be very much prepared for potential repercussions insofar as how that may change rules of engagement with the IRGC, both at sea and with our forces there in places like Iraq and elsewhere. And that I think these are things that we need to be thinking through. And so these are areas that I think designation under EO 13224 is probably it gets us what we want. But I'm certainly very much drawn to the moral argument of designating under FTO. And I also agree that that is the pathway that will get us the most effect on for pulling back on support for terrorism.
Thank you. And Dr. Ottolenghi, Dr. Maloney warned against downplaying the dividends of the nuclear deal in alleviating the urgency of Iran's nuclear ambitions. But given the forward movement of Iran's ballistic missile program, given the tests using missiles that are capable of carrying nuclear payloads, do you disagree with that analysis? Do you agree with that analysis? And can you speak to whether or not these non-nuclear activities have been emboldened as a result of lingering questions about the reliability of the inspections regime?
Thank you for your question. 2 points. First of all, I think that when one looks at a nuclear program, of course, the question of delivery systems is essential and a part of a nuclear program. The omission of the ballistic missile program from the JCPOA, of course, indicates that this is by no means a comprehensive arrangement, as my colleague pointed out in his statement. But it also creates an opportunity for the United States to target sectors of the Iranian economy that are complicit in the Iran ballistic missile program, whether it's the financial institutions that facilitate the transactions for procurement, the companies that procure, the extracting activities for the raw materials or the transport or the insurance of the vectors that carried the technology and the procurement for the missile program. All these are areas and opportunities for targeting. As for whether the regime has been emboldened, I think that that's very clear, not just emboldened, but also provided additional resources to pursue its most nefarious activity more actively and assiduously.
Thank you. My time has expired, so the chair will yield back and now recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank the panel again. As I expected, we have some excellent testimony here. So much information, so little time. Let me just start with Mr. McGinnis. Very well prepared presentation. I was looking at your recommendations for the 5 things we need to do, and I was focusing in particular on starving the IRGC's financial fuel. And so in that context, would you agree that there might be some threat or some problem with the article that I believe Mr. Perlmutter entered into the record, where it demonstrates that there was a lot of contact between Donald Trump in trying to establish the Baku Tower. And not only this Mammadov family, would you see that as problematic?
And in that particular incident, I still, even though I was, asked to comment on that particular situation earlier, earlier point in time, I don't know the full details of that situation.
Okay, thank you then. Yeah. Thank you. Let me ask you about your disrupt and deter Iran's ballistic missile program. You say that they're not going to even give up or meaningfully limit its ballistic missiles. And as I look through, just briefly peruse the Iran sanctions, even though I think Mr. Talian mentioned some things that they're doing, they're still substantially in compliance. Is that your understanding as well? Even though they're kind of showing off because they got to show their people that they're not caving, but they are in compliance. Would you agree?
Well, this has been the main point of contention, and certainly the issue is with the new language under UN Security Council Resolution 2231 that implemented the JCPOA. The language there, insofar as what they are doing with their ballistic missile program, that is they are using their ballistic missiles, from their perspective, they are not nuclear capable weapons. And from their perspective, the new language that was used to implement the deal, from their perspective, allows them to do what they are doing. Okay. And unfortunately, not all members of the UN Security Council resolution interpret that the way we do.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Maloney, we have talked a lot about Iran's influence in Syria, but would you say that Putin also has a stake in keeping Assad in power? And do you think that the Russian banks could help facilitate financial transactions to Assad in Syria?
The Russians are clearly a major player in Syria and in preserving and stabilizing the Assad regime. They do have distinct interests from those of the Iranians, and clearly that's an area where both Congress and the administration might usefully try to separate those two parties.
Right. And so we need to continue to be vigilant and cautious about relationships with the Russians. I mean, we're focusing on the Iran sanctions, but a workaround could be Russia. Would that be correct?
Russia would be key to any solution in the Syrian conflict, and we should be using all of the resources at our disposal to try to force the Russians to find a political solution rather than participating in what is effectively a war crime.
Exactly. Okay. I think I have one more question. I think it's for Mr. Talian. You were concerned. Are you concerned that Iran is on the verge of being actively weaponizing their missile systems in the near future?
Thank you very much for your question. I'm actually worried about the conventional and asymmetric threats that Iran's ballistic missiles pose. This is because I, like most members of Congress, read the yearly DNI statements before the body, and I worry that they are continuously assessed to be the largest force in the Middle East. So regardless of weaponization, which we should have better access to, but the Supreme Leader has not allowed inspections of military facilities, regardless of that caveat, which is a big one, I'm concerned about the conventional and asymmetric capabilities of this force.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the chairman of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee, Congressman Pierce of New Mexico, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGinnis, your report deals more with the economic impacts of having, I guess, the IRGC involved in economic activities. What's the scope of that? In other words, you say about 20% of the economy, but is is it import, export, or domestic economy? Tell me a little bit about that, and I've got several questions, so the brief version would be better.
Yeah, I think that the IRGC is certainly their domestic economy it could be at minimum 20% from their construction sectors, telecommunications, mining, manufacturing, but there's certainly plenty involved in the export-import as well. So I mean, you have a full spectrum there.
Who are their primary trading partners from outside the country? And do you see any, when you study it, do you see any difficulties with that part of the economy being diverted?
Certainly, the Iran's major trading partners tend to be, India, China. Certainly on arms sales, it's obviously Russia, and of course now that the sanctions are down, they're trying to grow significantly with the Europeans.
How about oil sales? What are they doing in oil sales since the lifting of the embargo, the sanctions on that?
Oil sales are obviously recovering up to almost pre-sanctions level, mostly to Asia and South Asia, but also recovering with Europe quite nicely.
About how many barrels a day?
I don't have those right up.
Any of you have that information?
You guys, do you have some?
They've hit 3 million barrels a day in exports.
So on page 4, Mr. McInnes, you talk about reinvigorated economic warfare campaign against the RGC, and what would that look like, this reinvigorated economic warfare campaign? What would that look like to us non-participants, the people that don't study this every day? You all would see very minor changes we wouldn't necessarily.
Well, I think that we had during the sanctions period a very fairly aggressive effort, especially prior to the negotiations beginning in 2013. We had a fairly aggressive effort against the IRGC on a variety of fronts. Of which one was, economics, and I think that there was certainly a decision to hold back on partly tied to fears that provoking IRGC reaction would potentially disrupt the diplomatic efforts tied to the JCPOA, and I think there's still a degree of that. There was up until the end of the Obama administration a certain fear of that continuing. I think the current administration is weighing those types of policy options of how much pressure can be put against the IRGC in weighing in potential reactions and being able to maintain the deal and what they want to do with the deal. I'm not sure where those policy debates are right now, but I think those are all things that what we were trying to do prior to the negotiations beginning in 2013, I think that can be reinvigorated and can be frankly made stronger, and that can be done against Hezbollah, against the Iraqi Shia militia groups. You can be quite aggressive.
I get the idea, Mr. Taliblu. In 2010 and 11, Iran was financing Hezbollah about 100 to 200 million, and kind of where was that money coming from, and has that flow increased now after the agreement?
Well, thank you very much for your question. The most popularly cited figure is 100 to 200 million, as you mentioned, and that's pursuant to a 2010 Military Power of Iran report produced by the Department of Defense. It's the most popularly cited because most of Iran's Hezbollah funding, like its illicit funding of other terrorist groups, is off the books. You can't necessarily find it as an IRGC line item, even though a colleague of mine who did do an assessment of, quote-unquote, the IRGC budget noted that they are receiving a 24% windfall in their budget allocation this year. I would note, however, that it would be hard to find on Iran's official reporting.
Okay, let me squeeze one more question in. And so is it possible to know kind of where all the streams of funding are coming from, or is that a subject that is not easy to penetrate? I think you just alluded to that, but go ahead and touch that if you can.
It's challenging, but not impossible. I think we should definitely task the intelligence community with finding these streams. You mentioned the funding in Syria, for instance. Hezbollah has been marshaled by Iran in Syria. Hezbollah was essential to help bailing out the city of Qusair in 2013 and the siege of Aleppo in 2016. So I would assume you would get significant funding spikes in those years.
All right, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee, Mr. Perlmutter from Colorado.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Ottolenghi, you said that there had been, there are coordinated efforts, I think were your words, to save the Assad regime between Iran and Russia. What did you mean by that?
I mean that both governments, both regimes in Russia and in Iran are invested in the survival of the Assad regime and its continuing control, if not of the whole country, at least of part of it.
Okay, so I guess one of the things that the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Committee deals with are sanctions, you know, whether it's North Korea, Russia, Iran, a number of other players. Do you have, in that coordination effort, do you see any assistance by Russia of Iran or the IRGC financially as they participate either with Hezbollah or Assad?
Thank you. I've seen reports in the media, which I cannot personally confirm, of a variety of coordinated activities of this kind, particularly transfers of weapons from Russia. I also, when I monitor the airlifts from Iran to Syria, I do see frequently Russian planes crisscrossing the same air corridors. They follow the same routes. I am not in a position to tell you whether those planes are just supplying the Russian forces on the ground or supporting the Russian aviation operations inside Syria. We do know from open sources, public reports, that the Russians have used one airbase in Iran, so there obviously has been some type of transaction there. And I would highly recommend that in an intelligence review of the airlifts, some attention is paid to what Russian Air Force planes are carrying to Syria as well.
Thank you. And I turn to the other panelists. My two questions. One, coordination between Russia and Iran, particularly with respect to Hezbollah and Assad, and are you aware of any funding streams from Russia to the IRGC or Iran generally? So, Dr. Maloney?
Russians play a relatively small role in the Iranian economy overall, but they've obviously been a long-term important supplier of weaponry to Iran. In terms of the management of Hezbollah and of the other Shia militias that are fighting under Iranian operational guidance in Syria, that's primarily an Iranian-run affair, but clearly there's coordination between the Iranians and the Russians on the overall state of the campaign. The Russians primarily from the air, the Iranians primarily on the ground, and that coordination extends to Hezbollah and the other Shia groups.
Thanks. Either of you two gentlemen like to comment?
I would just, confirm what Dr. Maloney said, and also add that what's been fascinating is watching how much Iran has learned from Russia and how to conduct and develop, new forms of warfare as they've begun to do certain levels of integration of their campaigns there in Syria, and frankly, the fact that they are, the Russians are using Iranian air bases at times to launch their airstrikes into Syria, which is from an Iranian ideological standpoint unprecedented. And it goes to the degree of how much the Iranians have had to shift their thinking and how they look at Russia as a potential ally. And of course, their long-term, as they look at post-sanctions, conventional weapons sanctions after the nuclear deal, the big investments they want to make in transforming their military, they're going to be very Russian-centric on that. And that's what I particularly worry about, is that could transform the region if they're allowed to do major investments with Russia.
Mr. Talibou.
Thank you very much. I want to echo most of the sentiments of the panel. High-level coordination could be seen by the visits of IRGC QF Commander Major General Qasem Soleimani's flights to Russia. I assume that flight to Russia actually had more of an impact on Iranian strategy in Syria than the more public one where President Rouhani recently went to Russia and met with President Putin. To Dr. Maloney's comment, I actually think Iran and Shia militias in general in Syria have a perverse form of what Stephen Biddle has called the modern military system. It's a perverse form of combined arms, non-Arab Shia militias as cannon fodder supplementing Russian air power. So it's odd to watch, but horrifying.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, Mr. Williams from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman Barr. Thank you, Chairman Pierce, and all our witnesses today. Since 2011, Iran has been classified by the Treasury Department as a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern, a finding that is unaffected by the JCPOA. The Treasury Department determined that Iran's financial system, including the central bank, constitutes a threat to governments or financial institutions that do business with these banks. Iran is also labeled alongside North Korea as one of the 2 high-risk and non-cooperative jurisdictions by the Financial Action Task Force. Last year, in his testimony before our Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, Eric Lorber testified that the nature of the Iranian economy and the role of the government within the economy presents serious risks related to bribery, corruption, money laundering, and illicit financing. That's a combination. Now, but despite these multiple financial actions by Treasury, Hezbollah, which we know has sophisticated financial expertise, continues to exploit the internal financial system. Their ability to move and store illicit assets make them dangerous to penetrating U.S. markets. Many of these finance schemes flow right through the United States, and our ability to combat them remains challenging. So some might say, despite these designations, Hezbollah's trade-based money laundering schemes have continued to expand. So my first question would be to any of the witnesses today is this. The designation carried no immediate penalty, but it imposed additional requirements on U.S. banks to ensure against improper Iranian access to the U.S. financial system. So in one of your opinions, what has this been an effective designation? Any of you? Okay. Punch the red button.
Well, I think, you know, the designations, especially when it comes to, if I'm understanding the question correctly, when it comes to Hezbollah in particular and Iran's, you know, deep problems with money laundering, you know, this is something that, you know, the more the U.S. can do when it comes to exposing the problems of Iran's money laundering and toxifying from my perspective, from the international community's perspective, toxifying these assets or these financial institutions, you know, so that they are avoided. And you know, that does benefit long term because it makes, even if as Iran finds ways around it, it makes it harder for Iran to move money, even if Iran still finds ways to get money and Hezbollah finds ways to get money. But again, I know it's extremely challenging to have those types of effects that we want. I don't know if you...
Okay, thank you. Doctor?
Yes, thank you. If I may just add one point, at least 20% of Hezbollah's annual budget actually comes from trade-based money laundering outside the region. It comes from Latin America, mainly from the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. The U.S., through its Treasury designations, has targeted entities and individuals associated with Hezbollah involved in that type of trade-based money laundering. But those designations are more than a decade old, and because of collusion, complicity, or just plain negligence by local powers in that area of the world, most of these entities and individuals are still able to conduct business and remit finances back to Hezbollah. So I think that the broader point is within the context of the power of designations and sanctions, I think that what you need to continue is to have monitoring, enforcement, and updating of this information so that compliance can be updated all the time. And as Hezbollah finds new ways to pursue its illicit financial activities, these designations can catch up. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Talablu, should the new administration consider any new non-nuclear sanctions, money laundering sanctions, cyber export controls?
Yes, and unfortunately I do not have a PhD despite my deepest academic desires for one, but thank you. I actually think that there are a whole host of tools, military, economic, diplomatic, informational, but on the economic side, statutory specifically, we can go after ballistic missiles. Dr. Adlengi mentioned that there's a whole-of-government approach Iran is taking to develop this potent ballistic missile threat. That means institutions that engage in research such as engineering and physics. That means the companies that produce the TELs, the transporter erector launchers that move Iran's missiles from silo to silo, from mobile launch pad to mobile launch pad. That means also going after the companies and entities that produce and and procure solid and liquid fuel. This is the propellant that powers Iran's missiles. To go after the companies that produce and procure the aluminum tubes and the carbon fiber that actually allow Iran to develop these longer and wider diameter and more high-strength medium-range ballistic missiles. So there is plenty of space. The one of choice, I think, to deal with this threat, because Iran's 14 missile tests since the deal I think is a blatant violation and something that should be addressed more urgently than some of the other threats you mentioned. This is one area I think we can do a lot of damage.
Okay, yield my time back. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and ranking members, for calling this, and all the panelists. My first question is for Dr. Maloney. One of the key Iranian entities targeted by U.S. sanctions is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. No sanctions have been lifted on the Guard, so business with the Revolutionary Guard remains off limits for U.S. companies. The CRS notes, however, that the exact relationship between the Revolutionary Guard and Iranian corporate or other entities is not always known precisely, which means that the U.S. or European companies may be inadvertently doing business with Iranian companies that are fronts for the Revolutionary Guard. That would obviously undermine the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions against the Revolutionary Guard. What can we do to improve this, and how do we get better at identifying Iranian companies with ties to the Revolutionary Guard?
Thank you very much for your question, Congresswoman Maloney. This is, I think, an inordinate challenge for the U.S. intelligence community. What the Iranian economy has done over the course of the past 38 years is effectively privatized through crony capitalism. That's not limited to the Revolutionary Guard, but the Revolutionary Guard's expansion in the economy is very much emblematic of it. What this means is that there are hundreds, possibly thousands of spin-off companies that have evolved from some part of the official government entity or parastatal entities that are formally associated with the Revolutionary Guard and moved into what is ostensibly the private sector of the Iranian economy. This makes it very difficult to distinguish between companies that are associated with the Guard formally, companies that are run or managed or work to the benefit of those who are former Guardsmen who, in fact, might cooperate and collude with the Guard. We have done an enormous amount of work, and some of my fellow panelists here work with organizations that can provide names of dozens and possibly larger numbers of companies that are associated with the Guard, but there is an almost infinite capacity within the Iranian economy to proliferate economic organizations that have some connection with the regime in power.
In America, the law enforcement has targeted and put a spotlight on beneficial ownership laws that allow terrorists and others, gun runners and everyone else, to hide their assets by buying assets. And under beneficial ownership, they don't have to reveal who that person is. I'm wondering, is that a problem in the Middle East too, and in Iran? And is this another way that the Guard is hiding money or able to easily access money by quickly selling real estate for $1 million or so and having money for weapons? And I'd ask you and any of the panelists to answer if you would like so.
Let me just make a quick comment on that point, which is that what we've seen during the course of the year plus of implementation of the JCPOA is that the elected government within Iran does have an interest in trying to marginalize the role of the Revolutionary Guard in the economy. And some of the penalties that we've imposed on the Guard, including the FATF designation and the government's desire to get a clean bill of health from FATF, have in fact assisted the government in trying to marginalize the role of the Guard. There have been instances, in fact, of Iranian banks reportedly refusing to lend to companies affiliated with the Guard. And so I think a smart strategy of trying to marginalize the role of the Guard and particularly penalize its economic activities would play into what are clearly divisions within the regime.
Yeah, and on the beneficial ownership, sir, yeah.
Yes, no, if I may add a point to reinforce what my esteemed colleague said, and also provide an example which poses a dilemma to actually a U.S. company. We at FTD have identified an enormous number of IRGC-affiliated companies, but what we have seen clearly is that oftentimes the companies managed to keep well below the radar established by the criteria for ownership by the agency created by U.S. law and by the standards of U.S. Treasury. In other words, oftentimes, although you can't prove 50% ownership, you see that they control the majority of the board and the chairmanship. And here is the example that poses the great dilemma for a great U.S. company, and that is namely Boeing. Today, Boeing has signed or has announced a deal with Asiman Airlines to sell 30 737 MAX to the third national carrier of Iran. And here is the problem that Boeing will face. The CEO of Asiman Airlines is the former commander of the IRGC Navy. He was the commander of the IRGC Navy during the Iran-Iraq War when the IRGC Navy was trying to sink U.S. ships in the Gulf. He is the former Deputy Minister of Defense. He is the former CEO of the Iran Aviation Industry Organization, a company an entity under U.S. sanctions still after the JCPOA. He's the former head of the IRGC General Staff. He is a professor of strategic studies at Imam Hussein University, the university of the IRGC that is still under U.S. sanction, and he was Rouhani's first pick for Ministry of Defense before Kamaluddin Khan was appointed. This obviously is a great problem. Companies will go into the Iranian economy thinking that because the ownership principle is met, they can deal with them, but actually they can't because IRGC.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee, Mr. Pittenger from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your excellent leadership in this important mission. Thank each of you for being with us today. We really appreciate your commitment to this important work. Addressing the issue of Section 311 and the JCPOA agreement as well, are there any banks recognizing that there are no penalties involved for these? It's not very punitive of what's occurred with 311, but are there any banks that are still operating under the SWIFT authority to transfer money, that they're going about their business as usual? No response. Does that mean there aren't any, or we don't know? Mr. Otto?
I would make 2 points. One is we don't know. 3 points, actually. One is we don't know. At least I don't. Two, I would make the point that that's why it is so important to ensure full transparency in all of the large business deals that are being negotiated and concluded with Iranian entities. This is a country that has been under sanctions for a decade, has engaged in some of the worst and most opaque illicit practices in the financial world. It is a country that is still the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism. We do deserve to have transparency in the types of financial arrangements characterizing the deal. The Boeing and Airbus deal are obviously an example. And my third point, if you allow me, is not necessarily directed to Iran, but Hezbollah. I mentioned that Hezbollah finances a lot of its operations from trade-based money laundering around the world. A lot of the areas where they draw financing from are weak financial institutions. There are jurisdictions where rife with corruption and sometimes collusion. One place that comes to mind, of course, is the Republic of Paraguay. I think that the U.S. government should look into these jurisdictions as possible 311 designations, precisely for the reason that sufficient compliance controls are not in place. Thank you.
This past year, FATF accepted an action plan from Iran to address the deficiencies that were found from 311. Do you think this was an advisable countermeasure? Was this an appropriate response? And do we anticipate Iran to do anything meaningful with their action plan? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your question. The FATF's suspension of countermeasures for 1 year, for 1 year of review, I think was more political than based on economic or Iran's desires to produce more transparency in the companies that it owns, be they government of Iran linked entities or private entities. I think the best argument for that would be the people who marshal the entities that Dr. Maloney mentioned, namely the banks that in the fall of 2016 decided not to lend. But other than that, I believe it'll be highly unlikely that you'll see Iran comply with those countermeasures, and they might have to be put back on. And I think this is something that we should guard against, and something that my colleagues have mentioned, which is don't suspend conduct-based sanctions and conduct-based labels and restrictions purely for political purposes.
Recently, a Chinese-owned company based in the United States, ZTE, was fined $1 billion for selling technology to Iran. What other countries are complicit in like manner that we should be wary of? Yes, sir.
I don't want to name countries necessarily, but I do want to point out that in my written testimony, I submitted a very comprehensive, what I think is a very comprehensive open source-based list of entities and companies that are providing material support and services to Mahan Air. Many of these companies are based in allied countries, friendly countries to the United States. I think that that is a perfect example of where the United States can put companies and countries to a choice not to help a designated entity under 13224.
Thank you. We are tracking the mining of diamonds in Africa, going to Dubai, and then back to India to be cut, and through some measure of trade-based money laundering. What awareness do you have of this, and what countries would be complicit in this effort?
You're asking me specifically, or?
I'm asking the four of you. If you want to respond, you have 20 seconds, please.
I think that once again, as you know, these networks are global. There's an established connection between West African illicit trade-based money laundering activities by Hezbollah and the tri-border area, and more broadly speaking, Latin America. I think that that's where one should look, especially at the transport, both by ship and air connections that move the merchandise from point A to point B.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, all the chairmen and all the ranking members. I think this is certainly a very deserving topic for a hearing. You know, as part of the JCPOA, we agreed to lift sanctions on aviation equipment and aircraft. Specifically, it commits the U.S. to allow for the sale of commercial passenger aircraft and related parts and services to Iran, provided that licensed items and services are used exclusively for commercial passenger aviation. One of my contacts at the IAEA, Ollie Heinonen, told me that one of the most dangerous things he did as an inspector in Iran was to fly internally in Iran. He said because of the sanctions, he said the quality of the aircraft was very, very poor, and the inspectors, to a person, thought they were putting their lives at risk every time they flew internally. They were okay flying from Frankfurt into Tehran, but if they had to fly inside Iran, very big problems. Now, as Dr. Ottolenghi has pointed out, today at about 4 o'clock, Boeing has announced a $3 billion deal with Iran to provide, as he said, 30 737 MAX airplanes. Dr. Maloney, and I've heard, Doctor, we'll go back to you in a second. I mean, this is a big deal for Boeing in its commercial aircraft. Do you see any problems in this? I mean, I look at the assets that Iran has in terms of C-130s and other aircraft. They're still flying some of our F-14s that they bought under the Shah. If it's military aircraft we're worried about, they've got that, and they've got the ability to buy Russian aircraft as well. Is this a good thing for the U.S. or a bad thing?
Well, I think clearly it's both. I've flown on Iranian aircraft inside Iran, and I can share the assessment that you shared, that it is quite hair-raising. And the sale of passenger aircraft and airline parts was something that the Iranian people, that Iranian leaders have talked about and attached great importance to. I've never quite understood, since it doesn't necessarily help their economy significantly, but certainly for ordinary Iranians, it was quite meaningful given the history of commercial air disasters within Iran. But as Dr. Ottolenghi has cited, there is clearly some diversion of passenger aircraft for non-civilian purposes. The deal does not provide an adequate remedy for that. I think we need to continue to adhere to our obligations under the nuclear deal. Violating the deal would only leave us isolated from our diplomatic partners and make us less effective in trying to curtail Iran's worst behavior. The most effective way that we can respond to the sorts of nefarious activities that Iran is undertaking using its commercial aircraft would be to work with our P5+1 partners to amend the deal to find specific provisions to add to the deal that in fact prevent Iran from undertaking these actions or enable us to curtail our sale of passenger aircraft in response to the specific sorts of instances that Dr. Ottolenghi has described.
Okay. The other aspect of this is I've always felt that having inspectors on the ground in Iran and having a tighter assessment of what their capacity is at a given moment was much better than what we were doing before, which was sort of trying to come up with a timeline, and several of those turned out to be completely false and inaccurate. Even our Israeli friends, the timelines they gave us turned out to be faulty, which is unusual. They usually have excellent intelligence. But I can't see how we are worse off by having inspectors on the ground there and being able to make that determination in a more precise manner. Do you agree, Dr. Maloney?
I do agree. At the end of the expiration of the provisions of the nuclear deal, we will have vastly greater information about Iran's capabilities and intentions than we would have had without it. We are significantly advantaged by the continuous presence of intrusive verification and monitoring.
Okay, thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ottolenghi, on page 9 of your testimony, you cited a story from the Jerusalem Post about Iran smuggling weapons to Hezbollah on commercial flights. You also listed 67 service providers to Mayan Air in Europe, East Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Do you have any concern about the opportunity for Iran to smuggle weapons and technology beyond the Middle East?
I do not have any evidence that they would be doing, they would be using Mayan Air for smuggling weapons, say, to Europe or to Asia, but certainly they have a history of suborning their civil aviation sector to nefarious activities wherever those activities might be. Actually, we know it for a fact because that was part of the reason why so many of their airlines were designated before the JCPOA, that Iran Air Cargo and other operators were being used to ship illicitly procured technology from Western destinations back into Iran. So I wouldn't rule it out, sir.
Again, I would be concerned given Hezbollah's international presence, including Latin America. Would that be of any concern for you?
My main concern when it comes to Hezbollah's overseas activities is their deep, enduring involvement in all sorts of illicit criminal activities, first and foremost drug trafficking. There is an enormous amount of open source evidence, including recent arrests in the tri-border region involving Hezbollah operatives trying to disguise drugs before shipping them overseas to mainly European and Middle Eastern market. That is certainly the most pressing concern, but where you have mechanisms to disguise the shipment of drugs, you can also disguise weapons, for sure.
You want to talk a little bit about the announcement today with Boeing. Your testimony indicates that Iran has been talking about just replacing its aging fleets. and one might think they're arguing this is a way to increase their commercial capacity. Do you expect Iran to expand the number of nations it has service routes to through all these purchases?
I do expect Iran to expand its commercial routes.
Where would you expect them to be expanding to?
Well, again, to go back to the point about Mahan Air, Mahan Air has already expanded its routes into European destination, adding several destinations since the JCPOA was reached, despite the fact that Mahan Air is under sanctions. The problem I see is that a lot of these aircraft that are being used in commercial, innocent, benign commercial routes to ferry civilian passengers are immediately repurposed once they come back to Iran to carry fighters and weapons to Syria or to Yemen or to potentially other destinations. They're used to carry back the wounded and the fallen in combat, and then within hours, as the photographs showed, they are repurposed back for civilian use. That is something that just shouldn't happen. The Russians are conducting their own airlift into Syria. They're strictly using military aircraft that belongs to the Russian Air Force. They do not allow Aeroflot or other civilian carriers to participate. That is the very least we should expect.
Do we know how Iran is going to be financing these purchases of these aircraft?
Well, that is part of the problem. A lot of these, by definition, the procurement by sanctioned entities was always opaque and hard to detect. But also when it comes to the deals that follow the JCPOA that have been based on licensing and are seemingly in compliance with the JCPOA, there is very limited public information available about the structure of the financing, the financial institutions involved, the leasing companies potentially involved. And I think that it behooves both Boeing and Airbus and potentially other aircraft manufacturers to actually come perhaps before Congress and make this information public and available. Thank you.
Mr. Talblue, you mentioned Iran's sophistication with money laundering through oil exports and precious metals on page 9 of your testimony. Given the Islamic Guard's past support for the Taliban in Afghanistan against the United States, is there any evidence of Afghanistan being used by Iran as a route for illicit trade and money laundering?
Thank you very much for your question. I definitely assume so, and I definitely assume that there would be, given a drawdown in U.S. forces. It's known that in Afghanistan's westernmost city, Herat, where there is a population that speaks Dari, that one of the preferred currencies is the Iranian rial. I could totally see Iran offloading rials into Afghanistan and Iran looking to tap into those other networks, particularly precious metals in Afghanistan. But it would likely come at a time when it feels like it has the least to lose from an engagement with the U.S. there.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to bring the committee's attention to the No U.S. Financing for Iran Act. Passed this committee overwhelmingly, passed the House by a very significant margin, but died in the Senate. It would provide that we would not allow U.S. banks to finance sales of airplanes to Iran. And I'd ask the witnesses about it, but I think we have even more expertise on this side of the room in the sense of, do we really want Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Goldman Sachs to be lobbying Congress in favor of Iran because otherwise Iran may be unwilling or unable to pay $10, $20 billion that they owe to U.S. banks? You know, there's a tendency for us to believe in our normal affairs that if the lender has control over you, and I've had lenders that have had control over me, but in international affairs, it's almost the other way. The lender has to beg the borrower, please pay. And I've got enough lobbyists on the Iranian side. I'll ask each of our witnesses, is there any reason we wouldn't designate the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization? And does it make sense to say the Quds Force is a terrorist organization, but its parent company, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, is not? Does that make any more sense than saying Osama bin Laden's right hand is a terrorist hand, but his left hand was not. Should we designate? Doesn't make any sense to designate one without the other. Let's go to the first witness.
Thank you very much for your excellent question. The United States government actually had a similar debate in 2007, and they were worried about designating the IRGC versus the Quds Force, so they took a risk-averse approach and only designated the Quds Force. I think that was a mistake then, given the role of the IRGC, and I think it remains a mistake now. IRGC non-Quds Force assets, such as its ground forces, are active in Syria. I think an executive order designation 13224 for the IRGC is crucial more now than ever before.
Thank you for mentioning Syria, because the face of this regime, or the face it would like the world to see, is that smiling, debonair Foreign Minister Zarif. The real face of this regime is Alan Kurdi, that 3-year-old boy on the beach of the Mediterranean who died along with nearly 500,000 other people as a result of Assad, but Assad would not be there today if it was not for Iran. Let's go on to Mr. McManus.
Yes, as I had stated previously, for moral reasons, I support a foreign terrorist organization designation for the IRGC, but I recognize, given some of the potential repercussions of that at this point in time, an executive order 13224 designation for the IRGC is probably the most appropriate route as we assess potential repercussions.
Dr. Maloney.
Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. It's clear that its military is directly involved and complicit in those actions. It doesn't seem obvious to me what the designation of the Revolutionary Guard does in terms of deterring Iran's involvement in terrorism or deterring the IRGC from continuing the actions that it takes. I think that the Pentagon has greater influence over Iran's regional activities than a designation would have.
A bit confused by the answer. We'll go on to the last witness.
Thank you for your. If I may address the question, and thank you for your point. I completely agree with the notion that the sanctioning the Quds Force without sanctioning the IRGC is basically making a distinction without a difference. They are one and the same. They're part of the same structure. And I would make the further argument that sanctioning the IRGC under Executive Order 13224, which goes after the terror finance and providers of material support to terrorism, would enable and open up the possibility of sanctioning hundreds of IRGC companies inside Iran. This would be beneficial to the business community as it looks into trying to identify legitimate interlocutors inside the Iranian economy while staying away from illegitimate interlocutors. The ability to designate...
Let me try to sneak in one more question. Dr. Ottolenghi, your testimony includes an annex applying names of service providers that do business with Mahan Air. The U.S. has urged countries in Europe and Asia to disallow the airline to serve their airports, and has applied some secondary sanctions to firms involved in aircraft transactions. Yet the airlines still operate in countries that are friendly to the United States, including Germany, France, Japan. Is the Treasury doing enough, and should we be sanctioning those companies that service Air Mahan planes when they do land in Germany, France, Japan?
So with your permission, very briefly, first of all, I think it is a very important question to ask Treasury what they have done so far to persuade these companies from stopping this type of service. Second of all, I think that the answer as to the effectiveness of these sanctions is very clear. When the United States imposed heavy fines on financial institutions that were allowing illicit transactions, the financial world got the message and stopped allowing Iran from conducting illicit financing, or at least introduced very strict compliance standards. I think that similar type of action with fines and penalties imposed on some of these companies would send a message across the board. Thank you.
I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I'm going to just jump into these questions as quickly as I can. Mr. McInnes, This is for you. Under the Obama administration's watch, Russia sold and transferred to Iran the S-300 advanced anti-aircraft system. Why do you think that the Obama administration refused to sanction those Russian entities under the U.S. law?
Thank you. The S-300, I mean, those particular entities, in essence, and I'm trying to remember the history here, so I may need some help with this. But
one of the most advanced anti-aircraft systems in the world.
No, I'm familiar with the S-300. I'm trying to remember the specific, the particular, the companies involved in this from a Russian perspective, because this is part of where I think our sanctions policies need to be going in the future, is particular when it comes to the Russian companies as they look towards potentially trying to work around the current existing UN conventional weapons sanctions, that I'm worried that we are going to need to take very aggressive actions in the future to prevent such major advanced technology transfers in the future. But I do think that that was a particular leverage that we were able to use, with the Russians during that time frame to prevent the transfer of something that was going to.
Did we miss the opportunity to use efforts to actually sanction?
Well, no, the thing is that was something that the Russians could do at that point in time. And we
so they weren't. You don't believe that they were in violation of the Iran Solutions Sanctions Act or the Iran-Iraq Arms Non-Proliferation Act?
At that point in time, I think that they under their authority, and correct me if I'm wrong here on the panel, but under Russians were allowed to sell those particular conventional weapons at that point in time.
Did you have you nodded your head at one point?
I mean, is that
Talablu, go ahead.
Off on that?
Yeah, he's correct. Unfortunately, the Russian counter-argument to those proposals was they cited the UN Conventional Registrar of Arms, which in Category 3 or 4 omits, quote, ground-to-air missiles, of which the S-300 SAM is one.
Okay, and if we're going to, I just want to stick with one more question, Mr. McInnes. In your testimony, you said that one way we can suppress Iranian military modernization and growth is by deterring Russian and Chinese equipment sales to Iran. What would those sanctions or efforts look like, in your opinion?
Yeah, and this is what I was referring to as we move forward. Is that I'm worried that we're going to need, as the JCPOA continue under the implementation, that we're going to need to look at sanctioning and targeted sanctions against, Rosneft and other subsidiaries that the IRGC or that works with the IRGC or firms connected to the IRGC and the Iranian defense industry. That's where we need to focus and begin to look at secondary sanctions that affect the Russian defense industry to prevent Iran from gaining significant advanced equipment like that. That's what I'm particularly worried about, and I think that those are things that we could construct here in the U.S.
Okay, am I pronouncing that right, Mr. Talablu? No? Tell me how to, I want to pronounce it right.
Talablu?
Talablu, okay, thank you. Since the JCPOA was agreed to, how have Iran's efforts to export terrorism changed, in your opinion?
Thank you very much for the question. I think, unfortunately, they've significantly been enhanced. The Iranian role, at least in Iraq and in Syria, in its quote-unquote near abroad, has deepened. Iran now uses the argument in Iraq that you need us more than you need the U.S., which clearly isn't true. The U.S. is the one leading most of the strikes against ISIS. Shia militias often, unfortunately, engage in sectarian slaughter on the back ends of the cities that U.S. forces combined with the Iraqi army actually liberate. So there actually needs to be a way to keep Iran out of this equation. But Iran is able to marshal these arguments and say that, no, you need us, we're in the region longer. And they'll cite, there's a quote from Qasem Soleimani that says, we're not like the Americans, we don't abandon our friends. So I think now is the time to actually come to the aid of states like Iraq, the central government of Iraq in particular, to deny Iran this argument.
Okay. Do you believe that there's a difference between conventional ballistic missiles and those which are designed to be nuclear capable? A phrase which exists in UNSCR?
Oh, so thank you for this question too. This is unfortunately complex. The Iranians have used the word "designed" in the resolution to kind of poo-poo any attempts by the U.S. and the international community to go after its ballistic missile testing. I think when we look at the word "nuclear capable," that's a word that comes from a specific metric in this international regime,
Right.
the MTCR. It's 300 kilometers over 500 kilograms, so it's range over payload. Most of the missiles that Iran has tested since the deal actually meet and far exceed that. But I think it's kind of an artificial metric to add, because there are many ballistic missiles that can carry a nuclear weapon, such as the Lance, which the U.S. sold to Israel, such as the Pakistani Hadaf-9, such as the French Pluton, which was deployed during the Cold War. These are important munitions that actually can carry a nuclear warhead that fall short of that metric. And I think limiting ourselves to that metric only concedes the argument to Iran.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question to Mr. Teleblu. One of Iran's advantages, as you allude to in your testimony, is to provide weapons that require costly countermeasures from traditional forces in low-intensity conflicts. The U.S., while its allies are often disadvantaged by these tactics, has the ability to exert diplomatic leverage through additional sanctions in a way that Iran, which is a weak economy, does not. The question is it fair to think about a strengthened, more effective sanctions regime that includes additional measures to deny Iran access to the payment network as utilizing a primary U.S. advantage? Is that a primary U.S. advantage?
Thank you very much. That absolutely is a primary U.S. advantage, and it is absolutely fair to seek those measures, but it's also absolutely fair to seek diplomacy with our partners to help interdict the sales and transfers of these weapons, too.
So that's a soft power way that we could leverage Iran. And I guess you could elaborate on that a little more, how we could go about that?
Sure, that is soft power, I think, hits the key on the head. We could target the entities that actually engage in the production or transfer of these weapons. There's another executive order. We've been talking about Executive Order 13224 all of today. There's another one, 13611, I believe, which came into force May 2012, and that blocks the property and assets of those threatening the peace and stability of Yemen. Iranian arms transfers to Yemen have been intercepted at least 4 times. There are Iranian anti-tank missiles, copies of Iranian anti-tank missiles being used in Yemen. So we could investigate, does the IRGC or any Iranian private entity which facilitates the transfers of weapons to the Yemeni theater deserve to be targeted pursuant to sanctions as defined in this new executive order.
Sure. So are the benefits the Iranians get as a result of this Iran deal strong enough to keep them in the agreement if the U.S. dials up pressure in other areas?
While it is important to look at both the costs and the incentives of Iran for it to keep the nuclear deal, I think it's also important to be aware of the domestic debates in Iran. Here I have an article from March 10, 2017 in a major Iranian newspaper, Kayhan, and the headline is a quote from Iran's deputy foreign minister, and I'm just translating it as I'm reading it now, and it says, the JCPOA wasn't supposed to make Iran's economy blossom. So he's basically taking the exact opposite of the argument that he's going to international banks and to the Western world. Basically, the argument he's making to the West is, no, you have an investment in the Iranian economy. But as Adam Zubin said, the JCPOA is an agreement, not a cashier's check. Just because we've agreed to waive sanctions doesn't mean we need to go actively advocate on behalf of the Iranian economy. That's something that they need to do by fixing their AML laws, by making their companies more transparent, and by getting the IRGC out of the legitimate private sector.
So if they still have maneuvering room, bottom line, because the Iran agreement is so good for the Iranians, we could get tough on them and they would still, they wouldn't leave?
To the best of my assessment, I believe that Iran has constantly cited in their domestic press that they feel that we need the deal. The United States needs the deal more than they do. I believe Mohammad Javad Larijani, who is the brother of Iran's parliamentary speaker, made this point in the fall of 2016.
Sure. So the Iran deal hasn't worked. The Iran remains the world's foremost state sponsorship of terrorism, and they captured and humiliated our soldiers. They're first-rate money launderers, as we've heard. They test ballistic missiles regularly. The IRG is now solidifying its place as one of the largest quasi-criminal syndicates, and the list just keeps going on. But the theory that Iran was a geopolitical equivalent of a lost sheep waiting for the international community to stop being mean to it, the theory that the Iran deal is based on has been proven totally false. So are the options for additional sanctions you've laid out in your testimony, is that an option for the United States to recover some ground in light of the total failure of the Iran deal?
It's definitely one of the many ways that the U.S. should deal with this. In fact, what is required is really a whole-of-government approach. I think there's been a significant informational leg in the campaign against Iran that's been missing, such as we've all been looking at Iran for decades now with this combined experience of this distinguished panel. But one thing that hasn't been said today is that one of the saddest things to see about Iran is that the constant prioritization of their regime's interest over their national interest, over their own narrow ideological interest over the interest of their own people. You see it with the Boeing deal, you see it with civilian use of military use of civilian airliners. This is something that should be highlighted in that informational campaign to supplement U.S. economic sanctions.
Thank you, Mr. Talablu. Mr. McInnes, in the remaining time we have, how would you or how do we deter Russian and Chinese arms sales to Iran through a sanctions regime?
Yes, as I had alluded to before, I think targeting increased designations of the IRGC, lowering the thresholds, to as we discussed before, perhaps down to 25%, and increasingly detoxify IRGC-related defense industries, so that we have an increased secondary sanctions regime, so that defense companies that want to work with the IRGC or sell to the IRGC particular types of weapons that we designate, we can continue to make it financing and make those types of sales more and more difficult for the Russians, Chinese, and others to do.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the gentleman from North Carolina be advised that the shot clock on the floor was almost exactly in line with his, and so the time on the floor has run out like it ran out against Gonzaga last night. So the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, for 5 minutes. And be advised, we are expecting votes just any moment on the floor. We'll try to get in the questions, but if not, we'll adjourn the hearing. So, gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McInnes, we know that last year there was a payment from the Obama administration of around $400 million on the same day or about the same time that Iran released 5 American prisoners. We also know that the Obama administration stated a number of times that it would not negotiate nor pay a ransom. This payment appears to be a contradiction of the remarks by the Obama administration, and people can judge that as they like. Specifically, though, is there any evidence that you see that Iran used this and any other cash payments following implementation of the JCPOA to further or worsen the conflicts in the region, such as the civil war in Syria or the conflicts in Yemen?
Yeah, I believe that the monies that especially in 2016 that Iran accrued from the JCPOA insofar as following their budget in particular, you saw a number of these types of allocations. That particular, what ended up being $1.7 billion in total from that settlement. Many of those monies were directed to be used by the IRGC for its overall military activities. How to discern exactly if that money went to specific activities in Syria or Iraq or to support terrorism elsewhere is hard to discern. But I think that it's pretty clear from analysis of their budget that the monies that were the monies that came out of the JCPOA, a good portion was very clearly sent to the military and to the IRGC for their activities around the region.
Thank you, Mr. McInnes. Mr. Talablu, yesterday there was a story that posted on the Wall Street Journal website, and it's titled, "Syria's Civil War Produces a Clear Winner, Hezbollah." And I don't want to read from the entire article, but if I could, Hezbollah today is stronger, more independent, and in command of a new Syrian militia that its officials say is ready to be deployed to other conflicts in the region. Hezbollah now fights alongside Russian troops, its first alliance with a global power. It was Hezbollah that devised the battle plan for Aleppo used by Syrian and Russian forces last year, according to Arab and U.S. officials who monitor the group. The one line that struck me, thanks to money and arms from Tehran, Hezbollah now stands now stands almost on a par with Iran as a protector of President Bashar Assad's government and as a sponsor of Shiite forces in Syria. So if we could, how specifically does Iran sponsor terrorism and other illicit activity with groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah? And is there any additional evidence that suggests Iran has taken additional steps to further destabilize the region?
Thank you very much for that excellent question. I think that observation is key because having been tracking the issue in Iran's war in Syria for a couple of years now, I've seen many testimonies where analysts have alleged that actually having Hezbollah fight deeper in the Syrian civil war could have a long-term positive effect because it would discredit them as a Lebanese political institution or Lebanese political force. Unfortunately, the exact opposite thing has happened, as you mentioned. In 2007, for instance, there were reports that Hezbollah was helping Iran train Shia militias on Iranian territory and then deploying them to Iraq. 2013 through 2016, as you mentioned, Hezbollah was active helping Assad take back territory. 2015 through 2017, they're reporting that Hezbollah allegedly is helping Iran in Yemen. So in fact, this force is growing its strength. It's not weak, it's not being diminished at all. And while the issue of exact number of payments to Hezbollah remains to be seen, Iran has furnished the group with everything from C-802 anti-ship missiles to a whole variety of different rockets, 107mm rockets, 106mm anti-tank shells. There's a whole slew of such munitions that continue to be sent to groups like Hezbollah.
In this Wall Street Journal article from yesterday titled "Syria's Civil War Produces a Clear Winner, Hezbollah," the statement that I just read to you, that thanks to money and arms from Tehran, Hezbollah now stands almost on a par with Iran as a protector of President Assad's government and as a sponsor of Shiite fighting forces in Syria. Would you agree with that statement? Are they equal or almost equal?
I continue to see Hezbollah as more of an Iranian proxy than anything else. So while Hezbollah may
if the chair could interrupt, we'll ask for that in writing. Votes have been called. We're down to 10 minutes. We're going to try to squeeze at least one more question around. Mr. Davidson is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your testimony. And I had a question about Hezbollah's activities and Hezbollah's activities with the drug trade in particular. And so there's been a fair bit of their involvement, but so far that ties to Lebanon, but not directly to Iran. And of course, there's correlation. Has there been any successful effort to tie the cash flows from the drug trade, particularly with the U.S. drug trade, not just in Latin America more broadly, but U.S. border trade? Dr. Otto.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. It's a very important question, and I'm very grateful you brought it up. The network that deals with drugs is truly global. The cocaine, of course, comes entirely from Latin America. It travels to its multiple destinations, Western markets mainly, but also increasingly to the Middle East. While I can't go into too much detail, there is plenty of open source evidence indicating multiple connections between the Hezbollah people in Latin America involved in the drug trade on the one hand, operatives and cartels trading and criminal organizations in Europe, in other places in Latin America, and potentially all the way to the United States moving the drugs. Connections with the Iranian network in Latin America, and most troubling, the financial links lead all the way to the United States. In other words, while the drugs may not be moved directly by Hezbollah into the United States and to the U.S. market, Hezbollah is using U.S. jurisdictions in order to launder the revenues from its illicit trade. So there is a threat to the financial integrity of the U.S. financial system from Hezbollah's illicit activities in Latin America that are linked to the drug trade.
Thank you. And briefly, could you mention any tools that would be helpful that aren't already in place?
Thank you. I think that one important tool is to empower the law enforcement agencies that are chasing these cases, especially down in Latin America, where the willingness by local government to cooperate is somewhat diminished by the level of collusion and complicity that some officials in these governments have with the illicit activities to which Hezbollah is accessory. Of course, once again, I bring to your attention the ongoing activities of Hezbollah in the tri-border area. In the tri-border area, there is an enormous degree of complicity, collusion, or just benign neglect from local officials, from law enforcement authorities that overlook these activities. Pressure from the United States on these governments would be extremely helpful.
Thank you. My
time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. We've heard a lot of testimony and certainly a lot of great information about what may need to be done next, but could you walk a step further and tell me what success looks like? If you had all the tools at your disposal, you were able to put these sanctions on, you were able to do these things, what would success look like, and how would we measure whether we've been successful? And then I'll go one step further, and that really goes to everybody if each of you want to answer it.
I think that's an absolutely important question. One measure of success is no Iranian ballistic missile testing for the duration of the deal, should the deal decide to hold. Another measure of success should be marshaling sufficient economic pressure to erode the ability for Iran to domestically produce some of these systems. Another measure could be forcing Iran or coercing Iran to stop sending men, money, and munitions to Syria. So while coercion is the primary goal, deterrence and punishment can be secondary and tertiary goals.
I would add to that, certainly you can measure that by, a shrinking ability for, groups like Hezbollah and others to be able to project any type of terrorist activity worldwide. But also, I think that, Iran's ability to be able to build and increase the reach of its proxies and their ability to, project any type of weapons against us. I think that, the increasing arming and ability to move their proxies around the region, for me, I want to be able to shrink that capacity to move this new integrated militia army that Iran has. If it can be broken and shrunk and slowly over time be able to be rolled back, that for me is what I'm looking for most importantly.
Definition of success would be a more responsible government in Iran, one that is not interfering in sowing violence throughout the region. But a broader definition of success would include an end to the conflicts in Syria and Yemen and U.S. support for broader political, social, and economic reform across the region.
I have fully subscribed to what Dr. Maloney has just said.
You have the problem I do as a freshman. I go last, and so I get to say I agree frequently. But, is it too much? Are we asking too much of these sanctions? Many of the answers that you put forth are very big, very broad, admirable goals nonetheless, but maybe too far a reach for sanctions or any political pressure that the United States can provide. Any thoughts on that?
I have the pleasure of working for Mark Dubowitz at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he's coined this phrase, sanctions aren't a silver bullet, but they're silver shrapnel. And I definitely think there's a lot of shrapnel that the Iranian body armor can afford to take right now. Again, it should be coupled with a whole-of-government approach, but again, it should be coupled with a whole-of-government approach.
Right. The gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and answering the questions. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you can. This hearing is adjourned.